It was September of 1945 when I returned to what was once a city, though calling it that felt almost dishonest, because Wrocław, or the place where it used to breathe, speak, sing, and carry the weight of its people's ordinary lives, had become little more than a graveyard with no headstones, a vast sprawl of collapsed roofs, charred bricks, silence and absence, as if the world had exhaled and never remembered how to breathe back in. I stepped off the transport truck with nothing but a duffel bag, my uniform, and the letter that had never been answered but had never left my chest pocket. The letter she wrote me before the front took everything, a promise inked in hurried lines and small, hopeful handwriting, the kind that used to smell like lilacs and spring, and the corner of a pillow left warm after a night of dreaming in each other's arms. The city did not know me anymore. It didn't greet me, didn't whisper my name between alleyways or echo my steps through the corridors of memory like I had imagined it would in the long, lonely nights of war. And though I tried to find the familiar in every crooked lamppost and cracked cobblestone, all I found were shadows of buildings and echoes of a life that had once existed in full color and now stared back at me in grey silence. Smoke still clung to the air like a memory that refused to fade, like the smell of burnt wood and ink, of paper turned to ash, of photographs that once captured love, now reduced to curled edges and blackened frames. And it was there, in the ruins of what had been her family home, that I found it, not her, not a voice, not even a piece of her handwriting, but instead a photograph, half consumed by fire. Her eyes still somehow untouched by flame, her smile reaching towards someone who was not me, whose arm wrapped around her shoulders like it belonged there, like I had never existed. I did not cry, because war takes tears from men, the way wind takes leaves from trees, slowly at first and then all at once. But I felt a collapse inside, something internal and permanent, like a ceiling giving way under too much weight, and I stood there with that photograph in one hand and her letter in the other, one speaking of a love that once was, the other proving it had ended without a goodbye. If this story touched something in you, like it touched everything in me while living and writing it, please leave a like and subscribe. It helps us share more stories that speak to the heart, that remember what history tries to forget, and that honor those who loved in the spaces war tried to erase. And now, get ready, because what follows will change everything. There is something profoundly strange, even haunting, about walking through the skeleton of a place that once knew your name, your laughter, your first kiss, your foolish dreams and adolescent fears, and realizing that while the street signs may still hang crookedly on their rusted posts, and the foundations may still outline the shapes of what used to be homes, bakeries, bookstores, and churches, there is nothing left to recognize you in return, as if the city itself suffered a concussion too violent to allow for any form of memory to survive, and what remains now is only the echo of structure, a hollow stage where life was once performed and then forgotten by force. I remember walking slowly, deliberately, almost ceremonially, through streets that felt at once familiar and foreign, a painful, uncanny combination, tracing the path I used to take as a boy coming home from school. Except now there were no voices bouncing off the walls, no scent of bread wafting from open windows, no children playing in the distance, just silence so complete it almost rang in my ears, and dust so fine it coated everything, even the air itself, making me feel as though I were moving through the ruins of a dream I hadn't finished having. I passed buildings that leaned like exhausted men, windows blown out, staircases broken mid-flight, doors swinging on one hinge like exhausted lungs drawing their last breath. And though I was surrounded by signs of life, scavengers picking through bricks, women carrying buckets of water in silence, children too young to understand that this was not normal, it all felt like I was alone in a city that had decided to give up breathing the moment the bombs stopped falling. And yet, amid that silence, I began to feel something I hadn't felt since the front, the terrible weight of memory pressing against my chest. not in a sudden, overwhelming collapse, but in small rhythmic pulses, like the slow realization that you are bleeding from a wound you cannot see. And it was that sensation that carried me block after block until I found myself standing before what used to be her building, or rather what remained of it, because there was no longer a door, no longer a roof, no longer a reason for my heart to be pounding like it did. And yet, somehow, I still knew I had arrived. The wrought iron gate I had leaned against in the spring of 1941, waiting for her to sneak out without her mother noticing, was bent but still recognizable, and the tree beneath which we carved our initials had been reduced to a scorched stump. But when I walked into the courtyard, I could still hear her voice, not as a hallucination, but as a memory so loud it silenced everything else. The way she laughed when I brought her the wrong flowers, the way she said my name when she was trying not to cry, the way we used to whisper about running away, never imagining that a war would run over us instead. Inside the crumbling husk of her building, it was darker than it should have been, the light filtering in through holes in the walls and ceiling, casting fractured patterns onto the debris-strewn floor, and I stepped carefully, as if afraid to disturb something sacred, though I didn't yet know what I was looking for or what I feared I might find, until I saw it, lying among splinters of wood and the soot-covered remains of what might have been a bookshelf or a desk. A photograph, edges curled and blackened, corners torn, but the image still surviving, preserved by chance or fate or some cruel intention. Her face, unmistakable, still smiling in that effortless way that used to undo me. Her arm around someone I didn't recognize, a man who looked whole, unbroken, alive. In that moment, I didn't break down. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I just stood there, the letter still tucked inside my coat, now pressing so hard against my chest it felt like it might burn through the fabric. And I understood, not the details, not the choices, not the years I had missed, but the truth. Life had gone on with or without me, and while I had carried hope through trenches and across continents, she had carried on breathing, and somewhere along the way she had found something, or someone, to hold on to. I left the ruins of that home with no destination in mind, just the aching need to walk, to move, to outrun the quiet that had crept into my bones. And it wasn't until I reached the corner of Elm and Fairview, a place where we used to meet after school, tucked behind a now half-collapsed church, that I saw her neighbor, Mrs. Johnson, seated on a stool outside what remained of her building, shelling beans into a metal pot with hands that looked too tired to still work. She looked up when she saw me, squinting through the dusty air, and after a long pause that felt like a lifetime, she said my name. "Marek?" she asked, not as someone greeting the living, but as someone seeing a ghost. "We thought you died. Everyone thought you were dead." I nodded, unable to speak, the words catching somewhere between my chest and throat. Because what could I say to a woman who had watched the world end and begin again in silence? "She got married, you know," she continued. "Thought you were gone for good. She waited, but after a while. Well, it's hard to keep hoping when the only thing that comes in the mail is silence." I thanked her, not because I had anything to be grateful for in that moment, but because I couldn't hold anything else in my hands, not grief, not rage, not even nostalgia. I walked away, not towards anything, but away from everything I had carried with me. I ended up at the old school, or what was left of it. Classrooms collapsed, the gym half flooded with rainwater, broken desks piled like bones. And I sat on the edge of the foundation, pulled out her letter, the one I had written her from Kursk, and though I didn't unfold it, I pressed it to my forehead and closed my eyes, not to pray, not to weep, but to remember what it was like to be a boy, who believed in the promise of a return, and to grieve the man who came back too late. What they never tell you about the front is not how loud it is, because the thunder of shells, the scream of iron, the cracking of bones beneath boots becomes background noise soon enough. No, what they never prepare you for is the silence in between, the unbearable stillness that stretches across the frozen earth when the guns go quiet and the fog settles and you realize in a terrifying moment of stillness that you are still alive, still breathing, still aware, and that maybe the worst part of war isn't death at all, but the waiting, the imagining, the thin thread of hope that keeps you tethered to something or someone who may no longer be waiting for you. It was during one of those stretches of silence, in the dead of a Russian winter outside Kursk, with frost clinging to my eyelashes and the blood in my fingers moving slower than my thoughts, that I wrote the letter, not because I thought I would make it home, not because I had any certainty that the war would spare me, but because in that moment, in the darkness between two bombardments, I had to believe that someone, somewhere, would remember I had existed, that I had loved, and that I had not disappeared into the snow without leaving behind something that said, I was here, and I had someone to return to. The paper was torn from the back of a Soviet field manual we had found abandoned in a frozen ditch, and the pencil I used was no more than a stub, the length of a matchstick. But my hands remembered how to write her name, and my mind remembered the shape of her eyes and the slope of her shoulder when she rested her head against me during the summer nights before the world collapsed. So I wrote, not poetry, not philosophy, just the truth of a man stripped of pretense and layered in desperation. I told her that I was alive. I told her I had been wounded but that I was healing. I told her I dreamed of her more than I dreamed of safety, that her voice echoed louder in my head than the commands barked by officers or the explosions that split the air like thunder made of iron. I wrote that I would come home and marry her. I wrote that we would rebuild, even if everything else had turned to ash. I wrote what I needed to believe. And then I folded the letter once, twice, 3 times, and pressed it against my chest, tucking it into the inside pocket of my uniform, the place closest to my heart, where it would remain for the rest of the war, through every march, every frost-bitten dawn, every muddy trench, and every night that smelled of gunpowder, rot, and fading hope. I never sent it. Not because I didn't try, but because there was nowhere to send it from, no functioning mail routes, no guarantee that any message would reach its destination, and so it became mine alone, a private relic, a handwritten prayer that I read to myself in the quiet, when my spirit began to fracture under the weight of what we saw, what we did, and what we lost. There was a night, months later, when the shelling stopped just long enough for me to sit by a fire, if you could call it that, a few wet sticks and scraps of canvas hissing more than burning, and I pulled the letter out again, unfolded it with stiff, shaking fingers, and whispered it aloud to no one, to the trees, to the snow, to the God I was no longer sure was listening. And in that whisper, I found something like peace, something like meaning, something that kept me breathing when breathing seemed too much to ask. When I was shot, a shallow wound in the upper arm, nothing heroic, nothing worth medals. I didn't cry out, didn't even feel the pain at first. But as I fell backward into the dirt and ice and closed my eyes to fake death long enough to stay alive, the only thing I could think about was whether someone would find the letter in my jacket and whether in the end it would make it to her hands, that she would read it and know that I never stopped trying to come back. I survived, not because of strength or courage or any grand act of bravery, but because of luck, timing, and the fact that someone else died instead of me. And when I woke in a medic tent days later, still clutching my coat, the letter was there, folded, stained but intact, like it had refused to let me go, like it knew I wasn't finished yet. That letter came with me through every mile after that, from Kursk to Berlin, from camps of displaced men to the border crossings guarded by silence and suspicion, from broken rail cars to bombed-out villages, until I finally found my way back to a world that had forgotten I had ever left. And through it all, I never once let it go. It became more than words. It became the last part of me that believed in something gentle, in something pure. It was the only piece of my life before the war that hadn't been shattered or burned or buried beneath a name on a casualty list. I would take it out sometimes and read it in the dark, Not because I needed to remember what I wrote, I knew every word by heart, but because I needed to remember who I was when I wrote it. Because that version of me felt more alive than the man I had become. Because in a world where everything changed, that letter remained. Fragile, creased, barely legible, but real. I didn't know, not then, that she had never received it. That somewhere along the way, my letter, my truth, my proof of survival, my love, had been intercepted, discarded, or maybe even hidden. But even without knowing, I carried it. Because even in silence, even in darkness, even across blood and snow and time, I had promised to return. And the letter, more than my own body, was the proof that I had tried. In the days that followed, I found myself trapped in a quiet kind of limbo, walking the same streets over and over again, like a man searching for something he knows he will never truly find. Pausing at the same corners, the same broken fountains, the same alleyways, as if repetition might somehow restore a sense of direction, or perhaps summon the courage I had somehow misplaced. The courage to walk up those steps, to stand at her door, to knock once and wait for her to appear, carrying the weight of what time had done to both of us. But I didn't. Instead, I hovered at the edge of her world like a ghost, watching from a distance as life continued without me, as if I had never existed at all. And in a way I hadn't, not in this version of her life, the one built after the silence, after the presumed loss, after someone had whispered the finality of my name into her ear and told her, perhaps with kindness, perhaps with hesitation, that I was gone. I would see her sometimes, standing in her yard with the boy, a child no older than 8 or 9, with hair the color of my own when I was young, and eyes I dared not study too closely, for fear that I might see myself reflected there, not in flesh, not in certainty, but in doubt, in the aching question that lingered like smoke in my chest. Could he be mine? And even if he was, did it matter now? I spent more time trying to answer that than I did mustering the will to knock on her door. And though logic told me that love should fight for answers, that truth was worth any pain it might bring, something inside me resisted. Not out of cowardice, I told myself, but out of respect for the life she had been forced to build in my absence. A life I no longer had the right to interrupt without understanding the cost. One evening, as the sun dipped below the fractured rooftops of the city and painted the ruins in long shadows, I ran into someone I hadn't seen since before the draft. Thomas Parker, or Tommy, as we called him back then, a childhood friend who had survived the front with half a leg and a haunted look in his eyes that told me the rest of him had not returned. He sat on a bench near the river, the same river where we once skipped stones and made promises we never kept. And when he saw me, he didn't smile, didn't flinch, just nodded, slow and tired, and said, "You made it." We didn't hug. We didn't speak for a while. We just sat in the quiet, two men who had both returned to find that home no longer meant what it once did. Eventually, he broke the silence. "She waited, you know," he said, not looking at me. "A long time." I swallowed hard. "I know," I replied. "I was there. I saw her. I just haven't gone to her," he finished for me. "Yeah, I figured." He paused, then glanced down at the walking cane leaning against his knee before continuing. "There's something you should know," he said. "Your mother, she got a letter from you back in 43. You wrote from the hospital, said you were wounded but alive, said you were coming back. You sent it to her, not to Emma." I felt something twist inside me. Not shock exactly, but the slow, crushing confirmation of a suspicion I hadn't dared to voice. "She never told Emma," he said. I closed my eyes. "She told her you were dead," Tommy added. "Said it was better that way. Said it would save her the heartbreak if you didn't make it. I think she thought she was protecting you both." I didn't speak. I couldn't. Because what words could possibly express the kaleidoscope of things I felt in that moment? The betrayal, the grief, the strange, misplaced understanding of a mother who had chosen silence over uncertainty, who had rewritten my story to protect a daughter-in-law she never had, and a son she wasn't sure she would ever see again. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to scream. But all I could feel was that familiar heaviness, that weight that had followed me since the moment I stepped back into that burned-out street. The weight of what might have been. Not because she stopped loving me, not because she moved on, but because someone decided that love couldn't wait in the dark forever. That night, I walked to the old apartment, the one my parents had once owned, and stood in the bedroom where I had grown up, the floorboards groaning under my boots, the wallpaper peeling like the skin of a forgotten fruit, and I opened the drawer of my father's old desk, the one with the brass keyhole and broken handle, and inside I found it, the letter I had written in the hospital, returned, and unopened, the envelope stained, the stamp torn, but my handwriting unmistakable. I stared at it for a long time, then sat down, and with hands steadier than I expected, I wrote a new letter. Not to rekindle anything, not to demand anything, but to tell the truth. I told her that I had returned, that I had survived, that I had written, that my mother never sent the letter, that I never stopped carrying hers, that I had seen her from a distance, that I had heard about her child, that I understood, that I wasn't angry, that I wasn't here to reclaim the past, only to place something in her hands that had been meant for her all along. And then I folded the letter, placed it inside the original envelope along with the one from Kursk, sealed them both, and waited until morning. But even then, I didn't walk to her door. Not yet, because sometimes knowing the truth isn't enough to carry you through the doorway. Sometimes you have to wait for the silence to give you permission to speak. The morning I finally walked up the steps to her front door, I didn't feel brave or ready or sure of anything other than the quiet inside me that had shifted, not gone, not soothed, but rearranged into something heavier, something more still, something that no longer resisted the truth of how much time had passed and how many things could never be recovered, no matter how tightly I held on to. The words I'd written all those years ago. I wasn't carrying flowers or wearing anything new. I had no grand gestures rehearsed, no imagined embrace waiting at the door, just 2 letters folded into a single envelope, one written from a trench in Kursk and the other from the remnants of my family's home, both stained with the years and all the silence that had grown between us like ivy across a forgotten wall. Each step up to her porch felt like a mile. Not because of the distance, but because of everything those planks remembered. The way we used to sit there in the warm evenings before the war, how her hand used to fit in mine like something meant, how we'd imagined a life together that no longer had any foundation, only echoes. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the worn wood of the door, my fingers curled against the envelope, the words inside it pulsing like a second heartbeat. And when I finally knocked, I did it softly, not out of hesitation but reverence, as if knocking too hard might shatter whatever fragile thread still remained between the version of me who left and the version of her who stayed. When the door opened, I didn't recognize her immediately, not because she was unrecognizable, but because she looked like someone who had lived through an entirely different war, someone who had learned to carry her pain differently than I had carried mine. But then her eyes met mine, and something clicked into place, not like a puzzle completing itself, but like the sound of a door unlocking so. In a room you thought was forever sealed. She didn't cry. She didn't reach for me. She didn't gasp or stumble or do anything dramatic. She just looked at me with a face that held everything. Confusion, recognition, disbelief, sorrow, and something else too quiet to name. And then she whispered my name, not as a question, not as a plea, but as if she were repeating a prayer that had once meant something and now only echoed because she didn't know how else to greet a ghost. "Marek," she said, and that was all. I didn't speak. I simply held out the envelope. She took it without a word, her fingers brushing mine for the first time in a decade, and though the contact was brief, it sent something through me. Not fire, not resolution, just a soft ache, like a reminder of every moment that had never happened. She didn't open the letter, she just nodded once gently and stepped aside to let me in. We didn't go far. She led me through a narrow hallway into the backyard, where the garden still grew, though it had changed. Different flowers, different paths, but the same light in the late morning sun. The same tree at the edge that had once shaded us while we made plans we were too young to understand. We sat on an old bench, the kind that creaks when you shift your weight, the kind that remembers, and for a long time we said nothing, just listened to the wind move through the branches above us, just sat there as the years hung between us like smoke. "I waited," she said finally, her voice quiet, steady, tired, "for months, then a year, then I stopped counting." I nodded. "I wrote," I said. "You never got it." "No," she said, "your mother told me you died." "I almost did," I replied, "but I didn't." She looked down at the envelope still in her lap. "I had to survive," she said. "There was nothing left. And when he came along, he wasn't you, but he was kind, he was safe. He asked nothing of me but presence." "I understand," I said, and I did. It didn't stop the ache, but it allowed the ache to breathe. "He knows about you," she added. "Not everything, but enough. And the boy, he doesn't know. Maybe someday, maybe not." I didn't ask if he was mine. I realized then that it no longer mattered, not because I didn't care, but because whatever answer she gave me would not undo the years that passed, would not rewrite the silence, would not give us back what we had lost. So I said the only thing I came to say. "I came to return this," I said, motioning to the envelope. "It belongs to you." She held it closer, finally pressing it to her chest the way I had for so long, and when she looked back up at me, her eyes were wet but calm. "I kept you here," she said, tapping her temple. "All this time." "I know," I said. And we sat like that. Two people who had once loved each other before the world changed, who had been torn apart not by betrayal or bitterness, but by distance, silence, fear, and the slow erosion of certainty. And in that quiet, something like forgiveness passed between us, not as a spoken word, but as an understanding that love, even when it is interrupted, still matters. When I rose to leave, she didn't follow me. She stood, nodded once more, and whispered, "Thank you." It was not a thank you for coming, or for the letter, or even for surviving. It was a thank you for letting her keep the truth, finally, in her hands. And as I walked away, I didn't look back, not because I didn't want to, but because I knew that some chapters are not meant to be reopened, only acknowledged and left intact. I live quietly now. Not because I've run out of stories, but because I've learned that some stories, even when they're over, keep unfolding inside you in the form of memories that rise uninvited, in the smell of damp earth after rain, in the way sunlight hits a wooden floor, in the particular silence that settles when a letter is read and folded and kept, not for what it asks, but for what it LDS. I didn't see her again after that day, not because the door was closed or the past was too painful to revisit, but because something between us had been understood, not resolved, not corrected, but honored. And that, I believe now, is its own kind of ending, the kind that doesn't require a final sentence or a dramatic return, but one that simply allows you to let go with both hands still open. I walk the city sometimes, not the same streets as before, because they don't exist in the same way, but echoes of them. And I see children playing where barricades once stood. I hear music spilling from windows that were once shattered, and I realize that survival is not always loud or triumphant, but often slow and quiet and ordinary, and that's where its meaning lives. There is no plaque bearing my name, no archive where this story sits neatly typed and catalogued, no headline or medal or monument, and I do not need one, because I know what I carried, what I wrote, what I loved, and what I left behind, and that is enough for a man who once stood in the wreckage of his own life and found, among the burned photographs, not a reason to forget, but a reason to key. EP telling the truth. The letter remains with her now, the original one, the one written by the firelight of a trench, my handwriting uneven, my heart so full of hope it trembled onto the page, and while I will never know if she read it again, or kept it hidden, or someday passed it on to the boy with the blonde hair and my silence in his veins, I know that she held it close when I gave it to her, and that was all I had ever needed. I kept a copy though, not exact, not perfect, just a hand-copied version I wrote one night in the room where I grew up, my fingers aching from memory more than effort, and I still carry it with me, inside the same jacket I wore through the war, the fabric worn thin, the seams holding stories that will never be told aloud, and I suppose that, too, is a kind of legacy. Because legacy is not what we leave in our name. It is what we place gently into someone else's hands and trust them to carry when we are no longer able to, whether that be a letter, a truth, a goodbye, or simply the knowledge that we loved fiercely, even if it was interrupted. I didn't come back to reclaim anything. I came back to remember, to say, this happened, we were real, and though everything around us burned or changed or forgot, something survived. Me, the story, the letter. And if you've made it this far, if this story has touched a place in you that still remembers what it's like to wait, to love, to lose, to come back too late, then maybe you too are part of what remains. We have new stories every day, true stories of love, loss, courage, and memory. If this one moved you, leave a like, subscribe, and share it with someone whose heart still holds the silence of things left unsaid.